Hi there. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this multi-layered slope chart in Power BI. This requires no DAX, but just a few simple transformations in Power Query. If this sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. As a little context, this visual was inspired by a Makeover Monday challenge that was set by Andy Kriebel on LinkedIn. Here, he wanted us to rework an existing visual to make it easier to understand and maybe draw out a story. So if I look at this in a bit more detail, the original visual, there's actually a lot of information to take in. It's not overly complex, but there are a few things here that are adding maybe some unnecessary clutter and noise. So first, if I look at the y-axis, we've got these sort of large numbers that are sitting in here. We've also got on each of our lines, we've got multiple marker points for each of our years. And then we also have these colorful lines that are kind of crossing each other. The color isn't really indicating like the performance, it's only indicating which country you're looking at. So I can maybe look at each individual line, for example here Sweden, and see the trend across the page. If I follow it across the page, so it's going up and down a little bit. But if I step back, I ask myself, is it easy to see what the overall trends here are for all of these countries? How many countries are experiencing an overall reduction? How many are increasing? Which ones are fairly flat? It's quite difficult to see at a glance. So in response, I developed this slope chart on the left-hand side, or maybe you might want to call it a little bit like a slope chart with a difference, as it has a few layers. If I look at this in a bit more detail, I wanted to show at a sort of macro level, what's the overall change for each color, or for each country, sorry. And maybe use a particular color to show that. So if it's a big increase, it's a dark blue. If it's a decrease, it's a red. If it's a light blue, it's maybe a gradual increase. But at the same time, I wanted to be able to retain the underlying data behind it, but maybe just blend it into the background. So I use these sort of gray dashed lines so that you can see the overall trend. But if you wanted to look at each individual country, you could go in and see, like for example here, the UK, it's got a decrease, but you see, okay, it was decreasing some years or maybe higher, and then there's a more dramatic decrease in the 2000s. So you can see in two layers, one overall and one if you want to dig a bit deeper into the background and see it. Then I added sort of a beginning and an end line, which is usually good practice for a slope chart, and then kind of link all of this back into sort of a story summary where we're using the color that we're using in the chart and integrate that into our story and reinforce it. So for the red for Russia and the UK, we're talking about the decrease or reduction between those two countries. Then for the dark blue, we've got Taiwan and Canada. And then for the other countries that have slight increases, it's sort of a light blue color. Okay, so enough of the context. Let's get into building this visual. Okay, so before we jump in and do the data manipulation, I thought I'll just have a brief overview of what the plan actually is here. So if we look at this chart, what we have in effect are almost like two layers of data. One is the sort of year by year data points, that are these dashed lines. And then we have a second layer, which is the sort of the start and the end point. So what we want to do is we have almost two sets of data that we join to each other. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So if we look at the data set itself, you can explore this for yourself if you get a look. It's got almost every country around the world. But for our purposes, we have filtered out, I think it's Canada, India, Russia, Sweden, Taiwan, the US, UK, and the world as a sort of benchmark. So we have these filtered, and we have, like for example here, Canada 1965 up to 2002. So we have this for each country. So that's our first layer. That's like the dashed lines that sort of hide behind the page. but we also want this data set, which is each country or area, and we want the first and the last year as well. So you'll see when I go through the manipulation, what we want to do is create two sets. One is all the years, and then one is just the first and the last year for each series. So we want to do that in Power Query. And then we want to union those tables so they sort of sit one under each other. And there'll be like an additional column to the side on the right hand side, which will indicate kind of what layer it is. Is it the dashed lines that sit behind the visual, or is it the actual colored slope charts or slope lines that sit in front? So I thought I'd give you sort of a brief insight into how the data is going to be structured when we go through the Power Query, and then how it's layered when we create the visual. Okay, so if I jump into Power BI, I've just loaded the table just get data Excel, but you can do it through the data world if you want to link directly to Makeover Monday. So we have our table in here with all the countries and regions around the world as our base. So what we want to do next is recreate this visual in here, but before we do that, we need to transform our data. So I'm in here. The first thing I want to do is to just make sure I've got all of these loaded in, deselect everything, and then go through and make sure I have picked all the countries that I need to. So I should have Canada, where's the world? Okay, so I don't need this code per se, so I can remove this. And I don't particularly like this sort of large number, so instead of kilowatt hours per person, we can convert this to megawatt hours per person, just so that we have a smaller number. And in order to do that, we can just multiply. So we transform, we do a standard multiplication, and we multiply it by 0.001 and rename this to megawatts per hours. Just gives us a smaller number. And that is basically our first table. So we have that as our reference table. So we just name that as a reference, and we don't want that to load into, that's fine. We don't want that to load into our main data set. So we just click enable load, but it gets refreshed, so it's going to be refreshed. So the next step is we want to create that first layer, that what I was talking about, which is sort of every data point. So we just click on here, and instead of duplicate, we just hit reference, and we want to call this our main data table. And there's only one thing to do here. We want to add in a column. So we use a custom column. And we're just going to call this type. So what the type is just going to be main, then dash, and our entity. And that's it. So we just want this additional column that identifies that this is the main sort of table. You can call it main, you can call it dash line, whatever you want to call it, but just call it something. We convert this to text, and that's basically our first table done. Simple as that. Okay, the next table we repeat that again. We just want to create a reference, and we want to call this, instead of ref2, we call it slope. So this is our slope data that we want to create. There are a few more steps in this one, so let's get to it. Now, if you recall, I could, in theory, if all the countries were the same, I could just pick the minimum and the maximum year, and that would be it. But one of the countries, Russia, it starts in 1985 as opposed to 1965. So we're going to do something a little bit smarter, where we can take the min and max for the respective country rather than just the min and max. So I'm literally going to use this table to group the minimum per country or entity, and then a separate table called the maximum per entity, and then union them together. So if I click entity and go to transform and group, and I want to new title is called year. What we want to do is get the minimum of the year, and we click OK. So there we get the minimum year. So for Canada 1965, etc., etc. We get down to Russia 1985. So we get the minimums for both of those. And if we look at the M code, it just tells us that what it's looking for is the list min. So what we can do is apply a second step after. So we insert a step after, and we can almost just copy this cancel. So we can just change this to max. And it gives us the max. So again, it goes through to 2022. So what we can do is just rename this, sorry, just so we know what's happening. We say group min, and then group max. So we've got two different steps. One has identified the minimum years, one has identified the maximum years, and then all we need to do now is just union these two together. And we can't necessarily use this sort of append, because append only works with individual queries. It doesn't work with steps within a query, but it's not that complicated. We just include a step after, and we can just say table combine. And then we use the grouped min. Spell it right. A group, sorry. So we have combined these two together now. We rename this union. So effectively we have just isolated for each country. We've got the minimum and the maximum year. Now in reality, these three steps, you could probably combine them so that you could just take the group min, this calculation, and put it in place here where the table combine is, and the group max again. But from my point of view, I like to just have separate steps. It's easier to kind of do it step by step rather than one, but you could always just copy and paste these in and then make it one step if that's your preference. Okay, the next step is then to reinstate those values. So what I can do for this is to do a merge with the original reference. And what you have to do here is make sure you select both. So that gives you for the actual date and year rather than just for the country itself. And you can expand this. So now we have the min-max years with the min-max energy consumptions. What I want to do now is just have that additional column similar to what we had before for the type, but I don't want, I just want a space and the entity. Okay, and just change this to text. So now we have our two tables. We have our main and our slope. What I want want to do is to append these two tables, so a new table, so main and slope. And if I take the old name, just copy it across here. Just call this chart. So I have kind of India, Sweden, etc. the world, and then I have the main, which is the one. So this is what I'm going to use to kind of differentiate between the two different layers. This is the controlling column to use. So that's why we went through that process. And before I go out of this, we just want to not enable the load. So the only table that we're loading in to create our visual with is this chart itself. So that's our cleaning steps done. I just close and apply. And it brings us back into Power BI to allow us to build the visual. So for the first part, we just want a standard line chart. We want to just drop the year in the x-axis, the energy in the y, and then the type in the legend. So it probably looks a little bit messy at the minute, but you can kind of see some of the patterns where we have these individual lines. So it's basically a case of formatting. So you'll see that there was no DAX required here, which is always a benefit if you don't need to create DAX. If you can do your data manipulation, that can help. Okay, so it's all about formatting here. We want this just as a whole number. And then we want to get rid of our grid lines and the horizontal and the vertical. And also the legend. So next I want the title and the subtitle, so I'll get rid of these. So I'll go energy use per person, and then also a subtitle. Go energy use includes electricity, transport, so again, you can make up any subtitle that you wish. This is just one that I've made up. X-axis, we can remove the title on that. On the y-axis, I think we can rename this. So we'll just call this energy use per person, megawatts, megawatt hours. Okay, so that's our first stage. So next we want to go and work on the lines themselves. So if I go to see main, so this is why it's good to have these, because if you have a prefix on it, then they should all be sorted. So anything that I have that's main, I'll make gray. So you'll see that it's starting to come together. Okay, now we've got the lines. We just need to change these all to dashed. So again, I'll just show you the first one, and then we'll just go through, I'll fast forward through everything else. So I pick Canada and I go dashed. So it gives us that sort of faint dashed line. Again, going down through India, do the same again, dashed. So I'll just fast forward through all of these. Okay, Okay, so again, one step closer, we got the two layers that are kind of visible now, the sort of dashed line and the colored lines. So what we want to do now is for the colors of these, we can't do conditional formatting for these. So what I chose to do was any countries that had an overall decrease would be red, so Russia and the UK, where there was quite a major increase, I think in excess of 30 megawatt hours per person, you'd have a deep blue, and then everywhere else where there was a sort of a more modest increase, it'd be a light blue. So overall the world was light blue, United States I think was light blue as well, United Kingdom was down, it was red, Taiwan had a big increase, Sweden had a modest increase, Russia had a decrease, India had a modest increase, and Canada had a deep increase. So there you've got those three distinct colors that are each showing or telling a different sort of story. Big increase, modest increase, overall decrease. So you can see at a glance, which countries are saying what. So again, next, what I want to do is show a marker on either side, so the start and the beginning. And again, unfortunately, when I turn this on, you get every marker. Oops. So there's a process of going through these and turning off the ones that you don't want. So again, I'll just show the first one. So if I go to main Canada, turn it off, turns it off. I'll fast forward through the remaining ones. Okay, so I have just the marker points for the beginning and the end of each. So next, what I want to do is put in the data series itself, so you know which line of the series. These are a little bit far away, so what I want to do is maybe set the maximum here to 2025, so it's a bit closer, so you see they're kind of lined up with the line, so you can see which country is which. And then what a lot of people like to do is to put a vertical line for the start and end of a slope chart. What we can do is apply the reference line, so we add in a line, we call this min, choose an x constant, and our minimum year. I know Russia's sitting out here, but our minimum year here is 1965. So we make this a solid line, we push it to the back, so it's sort of sitting out there. We turn on the data label, push it to the right, and then we create another line. We call this max. So it's an x-axis, call it 2022. Again, put it behind, solid, put a data label on, push it to the left, change the color. So that is basically it. So I've added this kind of paragraph or two paragraphs above to give the sort of this overall story or context of the chart, so when you're reading it. And again, good practice is to maybe use a smart application of color. So you've got the UK, it's an overall reduction, and Russia, the red corresponds to the red lines going down. We've got Taiwan and Canada have the biggest increases, and again there are two lines, Taiwan and Canada have the dark blue, and then the remaining countries are more modest increases, the sort of light blue. So this overall works on sort of multiple layers as a visual. We've got the context above telling the sort of a brief of the story, and then within the visual itself you can see the overall trends between the beginning and the end, start and end dates, and they're color coded, so they sort of reinforce what the trend is. And then if you want to see sort of behind the scenes, sort of one step deeper into the data, you've got this sort of faint gray line behind that. You can see the detail there if you really want to, or you can just look at the macro level. So that's why I think this type of chart kind of can work well in some cases where you want to see both an overall trend and maybe be able to see like the macro sort of changes over time as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Maybe you learned a new technique. If there's any other types of visuals that you want to see me get stuck into and try to recreate, always feel free to hit me up and let me know. Okay, until the next video, I'll see you later.